So the fifth speaker of tonight is Yassmin Abdel-Magied. He's a Queensland Young Australian of the Year in 2015. He's a mechanical engineer, social advocate, writer, and petrolhead. Debut author at 24 with the coming-of-age memoir Yassmin's Story, he advocates for the empowerment of youth, women, and those from racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse backgrounds. He is passionate about making diversity the norm. Listen what Yassmin Abdel-Magied have to say about creating an open conversation about culture. Please give a big warm applause to Yassmin.
So a father and his son are driving along a highway, Ford Mustang. They're going really fast, right? They get into a terrible car accident. The father dies on impact, and the son is severely injured. They rush the son to hospital, and the surgeon says, "I can't operate." Why? This boy is my son. Now, sometimes I tell this story and people are like, "Oh yeah, obviously it's a gay couple." Hands up if the first thing you thought, wait, does anyone understand how that can be? The surgeon is the boy's mum. Hands up if the first thing that you thought was that the surgeon was a dude. That, ladies and gentlemen, and all in between, is unconscious bias. It's the fact that we see the world around us and we expect things from the world around us. And you might ask, well, Yassmin, why should we care about bias? The reality is that we all have it, right? We all have shortcuts. Our brain, takes in 11 million pieces of information at any given point, and we can only process 40, right? And we do present ourselves to the world in different ways. Would you take the chick on the... Would you accept a plumbing job by the chick on the right? Or the left? Which one? Sorry. The thing is, biases are obviously a thing that exists, right? And our brains make these shortcuts. But if they're based on false bits of information, sometimes that can lead to terrible things. So my job is as an oil and gas engineer, and one of the worst incidents in recent history was the Macondo crisis, the BP crisis, right? And one of the things, they had 8 things that went wrong, 8 specific things from an engineering point of view that went wrong, right? But one of the main things they did was they suffered from this concept of bias. They had a conversation, they had a test that they looked at, and they all agreed around the table that the test had passed, but it had absolutely failed, right? And nobody at that table had the ovaries or the balls to say, actually, the test results are wrong. And they did the test again, but because they already believed that the well was safe, they looked at the information and they allowed it to confirm what they already believed rather than have it challenge. So they suffered from both this thing called groupthink and this thing called confirmation bias. We look for information in the world that already agrees with what we believe, right? And so what this leads to in situations like in my job as an engineer, but also in social situations, is that we make judgments and we allow things that happen that you wouldn't usually think. And the other thing is that our environment plays a massive role. Did you know that only 19% of the chicks in Disney movies have jobs? What does that tell our girls, right? Our young daughters? 19% have jobs. And there's another piece of interesting research around neuroscience that says if you deal with someone who you see as less powerful than you and a threat, you don't think of them as a human, you think of them with disgust. So your brain actually switches off the humanizing part and looks at it with disgust. This is why in the US, for example, we have lots and lots of issues with cops and people of color because they see them as less important and as a threat. So they switch off seeing that person as human and they treat them with disgust. Now, hands up if you think that you're an ethical person or you make ethical decisions. True question. The reality is, and Harvard research has shown that those who think that they make ethical decisions tend to be the least ethical. Soz. So everyone who didn't put your hand up, well done. And the reality is this is because we don't interrogate our decisions when we think we're doing well. And just a really quick thing around kind of environment. There's a fascinating thing that looks at height, right? Height and competence. Because apparently if you're taller, you're better at your job. 15% of men in America are over 6 foot tall, and 60% of CEOs in corporate America are over 6 foot tall. This is why I wear heels all the time, and I'm already a tall chick, right? Because for some reason, when we walk into a room and we're larger, we're deemed as better leaders, right? And when we think about cross-cultural communications, how does that pan out? And you might be like, well, Yassmin, I want to be judged on merit. I'd be like, Because the reality is that nothing in the world actually runs on merit. And that studies, which I've obviously spoken too slowly for me to talk about, show that when we actually look at the results of resumes with the same information split on girls' and guys' names, or different names with different ethnicities, and this is specific to Australia, they tend to show that people have these biases without even realizing. So what do you do about it, right? Really, really quickly. One is do this thing called the implicit association test, right? It's this test online, it's a Harvard test, and it'll tell you kind of what your biases are. Apparently, even though I'm a chick engineer who loves cars and does boxing, I really associate men with the bringing money role and women with the homemaker role. So it'll probably surprise you. It surprised me. And have a conversation in wherever you are, in your communities, about what culture your workplace or your team is, right? Because the reality is we may think that the culture in our space is actually inclusive, but most of the time it isn't. Most of the time, the culture is the things we don't talk about, and it's going to be uncomfortable. I work on rigs with lads from the deep south of Louisiana and Texas and Mississippi. So as a young Muslim woman who's brown who has to tell them what to do, they love me. I am their favorite person. Right? But these conversations are going to be uncomfortable, but it is okay. We should have these conversations, right? Because each and every one of us have an incredible capacity to change the world around us. And Emanuela just talked about this. Even if you plant a seed in somebody's mind and ask them to think a little differently, you've had an impact in the world. And that's what's important. Thank you.
Right, thank you.